Okay, everybody, welcome to episode two, numero
Número
dos,
dos.
episode song of the Siam Smoke Sessions podcast. This is me, Bill, with Siththa,
Howdy.
broadcasting out of Siam and Old Blighty. And yeah, so we've got a good episode for today. Just like last week, I'm going to kick things off with a question that's a little bit random for Sita and for everyone here. So this one is I wouldn't say it's a hard question, but you kind of would have had to read it before or come across it before. So let me ask you this, Sita. How many tourists came to Thailand in 2019?
Oh
How many
shit, 2019.
how
This,
many
this is the thing.
This is
You know
before
how
the pandemic era.
this is another one of my like statistic mishaps because I saw the statistics the other day for this year's tourists. So I'm just like shit, it's not
No,
that one.
I nope. 2019, my friend. You can't do this year or last year. It's 2019.
So 2019, that was kind of peak just before COVID
It was
time.
peak. It was number one year ever, just before the COVID era.
I mean, I'm pretty sure like it's like 2 million Malaysians came over this year or something stupid. So if like that's just Malays, how many fucking people came to Thailand? Uh,
How many tourists came to Thailand in 2019? This was the year before the pandemic era, so it was the busiest year in recorded history for Thailand. How many tourists came to Thailand?
I'm thinking high mils, so like 100 mil to 250 mil.
That would be awesome. But it was 40 million. It was 40 million.
See, I
So
just was like
yeah.
trying to round up to a hype number. I don't know how many people there are that really exist, okay?
I mean, it's a lot if you count all the people that have ever lived. There's a lot. I'm sure there's a lot of them that we'll never know, sadly. But in any case, in this episode, we're going to talk about a subject that we kind of talked about on the first inaugural episode of this podcast. We had kind of mentioned some stuff about the 1960s, the hippie trail, the overland trail, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the subject because there's some curious characters from that time that we both had kind of found interesting. There's a couple bits of local history and kind of history of cannabis that ties into the 1960s and the hippie trail. It's just one era that we'll probably be exploring on this podcast. We will be having guests soon. We're lining up guests, so it's not just always going to be us two. So these are just things to look forward to. Also, you might have noticed in the last episode a couple things with me and Sita. The recording was a little weird and wonky for our
Oh
inaugural
God.
episode. That's not the way I planned it. In fact, me and Sita had done a trial run the previous day before recording that podcast, and we both had like basically locked in like the method of recording. We had it all smooth. It was ready to go. And then what happened, Sita?
It's kind of more what didn't happen.
Hey, give the inside baseball here, man. People want to know what happened. People want to know what's happening
So
behind the
guess
curtains here. Yeah.
I guess we forgot to record on their end.
Okay, so there was two ways we were going to record it. There was a recording software I was using, which wasn't optimal. It was a backup, and then Sita had the recording system through our software here that was the more optimal version. But he forgot to press record after we had done an hour-long episode. So you did hear the suboptimal version for last week. Now, is that going to happen again this week, Sita?
No, we're recording right now. I clicked it. I checked it. I've got notes all around my screen. We're good.
There's
We're
post-it
Gucci.
notes. We're Gucci. There's post-it notes everywhere. Sita, let me ask you this before we get started. What did you smoke today before this episode?
Today it was pretty good because, like, when I got back to England, it was meant to be what people call in America and England stuff, quote unquote, croptober. You know, it's usually a big crop
Uh-huh.
season for weed.
Yep,
I get
yep.
back from Thailand, and for some reason, we're in a fucking drought. So
Oh,
I
there's
was
a
stuck
drought
on.
going on in England. Okay,
In
okay.
some places there was. So I was a bit stuck on some old school classic British mids. So like the the guava dogs, the strawberry amnesia. But today I got some cherry pie, so I'm a bit happy about that. A bit more modernized, better looking bud, shall we say?
Okay, nice. Yeah, I took some. I have some can of oil that I usually take during the day to kind of medicate. So that's what I'm on.
Boomer.
Pretty much, dude. I'm definitely getting up there, and yeah, it's definitely my preferred normal consumption method. So most definitely, you could put me in the boomer category at this point. But Sita's still young and kicking, so he's rolling up fatties and toking it up. So that's all good, man. So let's get this started. Where should we start? Because I'm going to be asking you some questions. You can ask me some questions too, but to set the kind of scene, 1960s, there's a lot of stuff going on. One of the things that's happening is Vietnam War. But U.S. in Vietnam, and then they're also in Laos and Cambodia. Now, we don't want to get too much into the politics of it or whatever happened during that time. People can read about that. We're mainly curious about the weed and how and how this has kind of led to what we have today. So, what was going on in Vietnam, and then with the U.S. Servicemen, and I guess there was others too. The Australians were there, and there was some others too, and the French were there before that. So they're not all their hands aren't clean in this matter. So, but what was going on? You had brought up just before the we connected here about a soldier named Peter Lemon. So who was this guy, and what was his deal in Vietnam?
So Peter Lemon was like the classic American tale of like a boy who was going to become a great soldier. Do you know what I mean? He knew what he was going to do, like aiming rifles at 9 years old and hitting targets, shit like that. So when this guy got into the army and, everything was kind of going off in Vietnam, the Red Scare, and, again, I won't go into the politics, but Vietnam was a very different kind of war. And
Absolutely.
as Peter went in with this hero patriotic mentality, he quickly realized, this war's fucking shit.
Yeah.
The base he was at was basically a decoy base to bring Vietnamese soldiers out of the forests, and they didn't mind being a decoy, just casually. So like Peter, to deal with this, started smoking weed because he wanted to relax and he had the jitters, and like a lot of soldiers around him were kind of going towards this herb to deal with the atrocities that were going on. And so it was quite interesting to hear that, soldiers just casually smoking weed before going into battle because they feel like shit.
Yeah. Okay. Was there anything kind of when you were reading about him? First of all, where did you come across the story?
So I'll give you the link and we can put it in the bio because it's a pretty cool video. But
Okay.
it's just I can't remember the channel, but it's like a cartoon short story history channel with a guy with the "So Peter Lemon, soldier from America" kind of voice, and basically I just found this video and I was just kind of in awe about this guy who wanted to be this patriotic hero, and it just he did, but not in the way he kind of intended.
Yeah. Was there any kind of like stories about when he was there that kind of stood out to you, or anything? Uh,
So
yeah.
the main story that got him his awards was basically, as I said, the base was a decoy base. So they were drawing out the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese soldiers, towards the base. And one night, one of the higher officials believed that he saw a formation growing in the jungle. So he got everyone up, ready. This was before midnight, so about, I think it was like 10, 11 o'clock. And so, they were like, okay, there's definitely people there. They fired into the supposed, like, where they thought the formation was, and they heard nothing, nothing happened. So the higher up was like, okay, I must have got it wrong. There's no one there. Sent them back to bed. And then Peter, being a bit stressed about this, thought, I'm going to smoke a fat doob before I go to sleep. He smoked said fat doob and managed to get an hour's kip until he heard a fucking missile or whatever hit the communications tower. He has to rush up high as balls, and the higher up was right. There was people in the forest. They were just waiting for night cover, so there couldn't be any air support. So poor little Peter and his other soldiers that are stoned, so just fumbling about grabbing guns. It got to the point where like he was just lobbing grenades into the jungle. The end point of this was like a massive missile silo where they were keeping ammunition in the middle of the camp got hit by a missile and completely fucked a lot of shit up. Uh, it killed some of the Vietnamese and some of the American soldiers. But Peter, he was injured and decided to keep going. And before he passed out of exhaustion and blood loss, he was stoned as balls, firing a machine gun into the jungle in complete view, just hoping to make everything stop.
See, this puts a new twist on the old meme of when the trees start speaking Vietnamese. Uh,
Yeah, trust
yeah,
those instincts because an hour later, guess what's going to happen?
yeah. It's okay. So, all right. So this kind of brings me to another, because again, this all relates to Thailand because the servicemen at the time were basically stationed in Thailand for both R&R, and then also there was some of the air bases being used in Thailand, along with the Thai government and service. And so when the servicemen would come to Thailand, there was a lot of kind of weed going around, and a lot of the nightlife stuff that we know today, like Soy Cowboy and stuff, kind of comes out from this time, Pattaya and everything. So but then there's also another side to this, which is kind of the hippie side, which is what I was kind of really curious to talk to you about. So a lot of this starts from really a lot of it in the UK. There's a lot of these overland tours that had started. The history goes way, 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 way back. But I wanted to just ask you generally, like before we started talking about this, what was your kind of understanding and impression of like the hippie trail? What did you know about it? We'll talk about some more specific stuff here in a moment, but like what did you kind of understand what the hippie trail was? How did you like in the UK or England, like, is this still kind of a thing that is talked about? Are there like relics from that time, like old buses and stuff? Like, what was your impression of all this before we started talking about it?
So like the hippie trail for Britain is still is definitely a thing. Like you'll hear of the kids going on like I need a gap year or like that kind of phase in life, and the hippie trail is kind of one that people still use, as well as like the hippie trail as well. I can't remember the name of a protester, but he was a climate change protester. It might have been Swampy or it might have been another guy. There was a lot of English people that like to do walking, like to say, but one of the protesters for like eco-friendliness and climate change, he did the whole hippie trail by foot, I believe. I
When
will
was this
find
though?
out. This was like the 70s, 80s, so this wasn't like the early 60s, like when it kind of kicked off, but that was like a story I remember. Again, I'm a young boy.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so but this is something like you were kind of familiar with. So there was this guy who walked it. Uh, what was most interesting to me? There's a couple people who have kind of documented some of this. One was a gentleman from the UK named Richard Gregory,
Yep.
um, and again, we'll put all this in the show notes. Now, he kind of talks about the history of it, and it's across all the countries. So the popular ones are, like Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, India, Nepal, and then there was kind of like that's kind of the main route to like Kathmandu, and then there was kind of like a extension, they called it, like the Southeast Asia extension, which would go through like Burma, Thailand, down to Singapore, Hong Kong, even Indonesia. And so he documents a lot of the history about who had started it in England, who had started coming over when, all the kind of, the cannabis history related to it. So from what I had read in the modern era, at least, because this kind of trail kind of goes all the way back to something we were talking about last week, which was like the Silk Route or Silk Road
Mm.
routes. You could go back to like Alexander the Great, who had invaded like Persia, Afghanistan, India, like 2,300 years ago. You could go back to like Marco Polo, who had done these routes. There was a guy in kind of like late medieval slash kind of early Renaissance named John Mildenhall I had come across, who was an Englishman who had traveled overland to India from England in the 1600s. So there's kind of this history of like going back and forth between Europe and Asia through this overland route, which is very difficult, but became interesting when in the modern era. So in like the early 20th century, it really started to kick off again in 1924. There were three guys who drove from Leeds. Where is Leeds?
Leeds. This. I'm going to sound like a terrible Brit because I am shit with English geography. I believe Leeds is north. I'm sorry, Leeds guys. I believe it's north west-ish near Liverpool somewhere. I don't fucking know, guys. I
Yeah,
travel
I'm
out
gonna
of
have to
England,
find
not
another.
around England.
I'm gonna need to find another British co-host here.
You found the perfect British person to not talk about England.
Fair. I'm sure we're gonna get some hate mail about this. And again, you're welcome to come on and rumble with us a little bit. But wherever Leeds is, somewhere there in England, where Siththa
It's in the north middle. As I stare down at my Google Maps, I totally know off the top of my head. It is in the north middle of the mid north of England.
Okay. There we go. So they had taken a Wolsey 15, which is some sort of vehicle, which I'm going to find pictures of. They had driven that all the way to India, and they had filmed it. So I'm gonna try to track down the film if it's out there. This was in 1924. Over the years, there was more people who took the trip, but it wasn't until the post World War II era, 1957, where the infamous or famous or renowned India Man bus brought a new generation to the trail. And this is one bus that kind of has a big place in the whole history of this. And then after this point, after 1957, is really when larger amounts of people started coming over. One bus became caravans. There would be caravans that would come across. More and more people would come overland, and it became the Hippie Trail. So with the reading you've done, so that kind of sets just a little bit of the scene, like with reading some of Richard Gregory's accounts of this, like what were some of the things that stuck out to you, whether it was like the traveling, the cannabis, like what was the interesting parts to you, at least, Siththa?
I mean, one interesting thing about like doing about the hippie trail is pretty much most countries on the hippie trail had some sort of weed. That
Right.
was that was interesting. Like I don't know if it was just by coincidence or, you know, but like there's what you can do a complete like tour of weed history by going on the hippie trail, like the way hashish is done in Turkey, Iraq, and stuff like that. Then you get down to more Southeast Asia where there's the Thai stick and the brick and the bundles. So that was interesting to me to see basically, in my opinion, partially a trade route for weed.
And that's kind of what it became.
Yeah, that's fucking cool as shit. Like
Yeah.
even though what didn't intend like that, like it's called the hippie trail, but again, hippie is kind of in quotes, let's just say a little bit, because like bringing up from the guys from Leeds, they weren't hippies. If you were the hippies weren't that rich back then.
Well, no, this was at that point it was called the Overland Trail.
That's what I'm. That's why that is pretty
Hip
cool
they,
that there is this external history. Like everyone hears about the hippie trail, but
right.
it's not just the hippie trail. There is overland, and then even further back with, like you mentioned, Alexander the Great, Marco Polo. But just this route system is just the whole route system, like solidified in history, not just by under one name, but as a
Right.
whole. It's fucking interesting. Like
That is a good
it's got
point.
so much history to it. It's not just this thing from the 60s. It goes hundreds of years back.
That is a good point. That is a good point. Uh, Now I wonder too. Okay, so with the cannabis that was being produced, because this all relates to. I mean, I think what it gets to me at least is like at least since the when it was called the hippie trail, like after the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, when cannabis really started to be brought back to Europe in large quantities, um, it started to change, the culture in Europe, and kind of formed to what we have today. Like Amsterdam, for example, being a capital of cannabis, I think comes out of this because when the people were coming back from these routes, they were bringing hashish and charas and flour back from their travels to resell in Europe, and they would get to places like Amsterdam, and it became kind of like a place where people would kind of settle. And there was reasons for that. But I also was reading too that even before, like in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, um, the cannabis was being brought back and used, especially with like the writers and the artists of the time. They would have like cannabis and like hash, parties basically. And so it's not like cannabis just got to Europe during the hippie time either. It was coming to Europe before, but I think it proliferated in a bigger way after the 1960s. Like it started to become used by more and more people, I would imagine, if you look at it that way. Now, I guess the question that I'm curious on your end is like, so with all this said, like with the hash, like where would you have gone? Like where would, like if you could go back to, like, let's say 1965, and there's the hippie trail, there's the India Man bus, there's these caravans. What route would you have taken? Like if like your dream route, if you go back during this time, like what route would you have taken?
See, like I am a simp for like the Southeast Asian countries and the more Far East countries. So like Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand. But like if I was gonna do like any main route, I'd have at this time I'd have to go through India, Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan. Those four, like the India, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey. Those four are kind of like main on my basis because of weed history, like especially hash history. Afghanistan, Iran, and India have a massive, hundreds of years long, like process and tradition with hashish that like you see it a lot. You see it today, but I want to see it like just when people were going over and seeing these stoned farmers in a way making this incredible resin. Um, it's kind of yeah, like I said, I'm a simp for Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia and all those kind of places in the world. But like at that time in the world, I want to go to the source of when things were really popping for weed.
Yeah. Now
Also,
it
I don't
makes
really want to go to a war area. I don't want to be near Vietnam or anything.
hmm, yeah. Now it makes me wonder. What I was trying to find while I was reading up on some of this stuff was, the way Thailand plays into this, with cannabis, because of course, and it's something we had brought up in the last episode, which is the Thai stick, which is kind of like the method of transporting it or like preserving it slash maybe curing and drying it, which is like that bundle, as opposed to a specific strain. Although Thailand does have like more of a sativa bent, like we had talked about, and there's
Yeah.
landrace. Now, did Thailand have a tradition of producing hash? Because a lot of these places on the overland or the hippie trail or the Silk Road or this cannabis road, really, if you kind of look at it that way, because that's what it kind of was. A lot of them are, what I noticed was, like if you look at Morocco, Afghanistan, India, Nepal, a lot of it is focused on the hash.
To
Now,
get, I can explain a little bit.
okay, please do, but I have one question. Did Thailand also have that hash tradition? And if not, why not?
So Thailand did, but not like anywhere near as mainstream as India, Afghanistan, Morocco, Nepal. And one reason is because of the strains, the landrace strains. So you've got more sativa-like strains in Thailand. They're not really uh people wouldn't these days would say hash producers or resinous.
Okay.
People breed for hash these days, some, with genetics these days. So for that, you kind of need a bigger build, it's a bit more bulkiness. So those more like India-based genetics, where it's a little bit, more indica side of things, and it's going to the climate there will help as well. The buds are basically more resinous,
Yeah.
and I don't strictly fully know why they kind of leaned to more hash in those countries, whereas Thailand and over more the flower and stuff. But I think one of the reasons is because the I think storage, it's a lot easier to get all this hash off the plant and store it. So rambling a little bit now, but yeah, I think the main reason that like Thailand didn't is because of the type of weed they were growing. It's not really
Okay.
resinous and hash based, but again, it did happen because part of the like other rumors you'd hear of like opium in weed came from some like quote unquote Nepalese balls, the hash balls that
The
people talk
temple
about,
balls. Yeah.
temple balls. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that kind of did like make its way into Thailand a little bit, but again, only because of trade and this kind of the hippie trail, really. Before that, it wasn't massive from what I can tell, anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, because so like Sitha was saying, with the sativa weed in Thailand, it's not ideal for producing hash, and the countries that were more famous for hash, like Afghanistan, Nepal, Morocco, they're really growing like a different plant in a way, which is more ideal. And then also, I think one thing that like related to like the hippie trail that I thought was interesting, a lot of the people that were bringing cannabis back to Europe often were bringing hash, and I think the reason for that is you could get a better price for it was, I don't know if you saw on Richard Gregory's site the prices, but it was something very inexpensive to buy hash in, say, Nepal, and then to bring it back you could get a pretty good price in Europe. So it was because of the strength of hash, and so you could transport it easier for a more potent type of product. It was cheap to buy, and then if you got caught with it, there was a system in place that, and this is something that I thought was kind of interesting in his accounts of this time, which is that basically they had like funds set up for people, which like a percentage of it would go to criminal defense and like bailing people out funds if they were in jail at any place along the trail. So like if they got arrested in, coming into Europe, or if they got arrested, excuse me, somewhere in Nepal or wherever they would get arrested, there was a percentage of the funds that they would pay for, like the booklets and stuff that were kind of used by them to as like guides, and different things like that, and different like tours. Like a percentage of them of the funds would go to the bail funds, which I thought was interesting. So I think that also has a part to play in why hash came to Europe more than anything. Is that kind of what you had understood too, or what do you think?
Oh, definitely. Like if you think about transportation and the potency, hash is a lot easier to take with you. Like you can get way more out of hash for how much you have than you would if you brought back like, okay, let's say you brought back an ounce of flour compared to bringing back 7 grams of hash. Like the hash is probably still going to last you just as long, or maybe even longer. But you're going to get caught easier with flour.
Right,
There's a
right.
reason hash is like the number one smuggled version of weed.
Yeah, and especially for Europe too, because in the U.S. we didn't really mess around with hash too much. Now, I
No,
mean,
no.
you can get hash. Like, don't get me wrong, you can. And people would always like. I remember growing up, people would like make like bubble hash and stuff.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like smuggled in like it is into Europe at all, like whatsoever. Brick weed from Mexico was always the thing back in the day, and now the U.S. doesn't need all of that. Like there's the market's like more mature and stuff, but I don't think hash was really ever a massive thing like it was in Europe. And I think this overland trail has a big part to play in that, in terms of what was being smuggled and why. Uh, but that leads me to kind of bringing it back to the Thailand thing. And this is something we touched on a little bit last week with like Thai stick. Um, Now with the war going on, because there was a lot of, because a lot of the U.S. soldiers, they would get weed, they would get this, they would get that, they would get, opium, they would get heroin, whatever they could get. A lot of that they started to bring back to the U.S. And I would imagine Thai stick was part of this. Um, was this part of was this being brought back to Europe too? Was Thai stick a thing in Europe at this time, or or England, or is it talked about in the same way in those countries in Europe and UK as it is in the US, or what's the experience there?
Oh, definitely. If you speak to like some of the, as we refer to them, old heads,
Yeah,
like the in England, Thai stick was definitely, I think, even possibly more of a bigger thing than America in like compared to like the brickweed and Thai stick, like on a average.
I don't
Like
know
Thai
about
stick,
that.
really? Because I feel like we got way more Thai stick than we ever did brickweed.
But we're talking about like the 1960s and 70s here.
Yeah, I still. See, that's what I mean. I think England was more Thai stick and hash than ever like brickweed as well. I mean, there was brickweed, but because you guys are way closer to Mexico and those kind of countries, I don't know. I feel like I've spoken to more people that there was brickweed, like lamb's bread and stuff like that, but Thai stick seems pretty popular. I
Okay.
could be wrong, but I could be just dabbling with certain types of old heads, but Thai stick seemed very popular here, especially. I mean, probably you guys probably had it a lot more than us if we're talking quantity and as well as ease because of the whole, I will now go into the whole army postal system that so much soldiers like to abuse.
Well, that's what I
Um,
was kind of referring. I think that's yeah, that's quite. I mean, there was most definitely a lot of it coming into the U.S. at that time. It
I
was
think,
a
yeah, you
yeah.
guys definitely got more than us, but I think like in the more like, I think what I'm thinking is the more notable weed, the better, more interesting stuff in England seemed to be Thai stick over than the brick weed, but you guys definitely got it way more easier.
Okay. Interesting. So that's interesting. Yeah, that's something that I'm curious about. I'm gonna have to, because okay, so there's a couple people that I know in Chiang Mai who were around in the 1960s and 70s, and I'm going to be talking to them and see if they want to come on the podcast. So that we're gonna have to settle some of this stuff because it was my understanding that Thai stick was pretty popular at this time in the U.S. And the brick stuff, I'm not sure what its place was, but to me, the brick stuff was more of a later thing, but I could be wrong. Um, but that's something I want to settle because there's a couple people I know that were in Thailand at this time, and then also a couple people that had, were involved with narcotics at that time. So I'm gonna see if we can get a couple of people on the podcast because there's some of these questions that. So that's an interesting thing too, though, because there a lot of these questions about this time. A lot of it is kind of surrounded by like myth and rumor, you know,
Yeah.
and it becomes difficult to get to the truth. A lot of this because it's all like basically for like you have to go on firsthand accounts of people, and very few people had written anything down. Now there are some books of this time, and we could probably start to look at books a little bit closer. For this episode, we looked at a couple of people's works, mainly this Richard Gregory fellow. There's also Richard Ehrlich, who was around during this time, and he had written on. He was kind of like a journalist who worked out of Thailand. He had interviewed Charles Sobraj, the what's his name? What do they call him? The Netflix show.
Oh, geez. Yeah, I know who you mean.
Yeah, the hippie killer, basically. The show on Netflix.
Yeah.
It's just yeah. Anyway, he had interviewed him in a jail in prison in India, and so I've corresponded with Richard a little bit. So let's see if we can get him on the show at some point. But big point is like there's from this time, and we don't have much time either because a lot of these, the time between then and now is what 50 years already, 50, 60 years. So a lot of these old heads that we're talking about, I mean, every day we're losing another one. It's so we need to get their first hand accounts. I think if we could get some of these guys, and if there's gals too, get them on the podcast for actual interviews because there's some of their work that's been written, but a lot of them haven't written much. There's a few that stand out that have, but again, even then, it's their accounts. It's like what they remember. So the more we could get of that, I think would be good, especially as it relates to Thailand and how it relates to cannabis history during this time, because I think a lot of that puts the foundation for what we have now. So that's at least my thoughts.
Oh, definitely. And again, just to like elaborate on our dynamic a little bit, like with you saying like things are a bit of a mystery and stuff, as well with like the dynamic of me being British, you being American. The mysteries in England were still very different than the mysteries in America, even though they're just mysteries and tales of weed. So that's why, like, when I'm talking to you, I may think or have an opinion on something a bit differently because that's what the old heads thought here. That's what I've been told. So, like, again, I think I don't know 100% the communication on like what America was dealing with because, England wasn't part of the Vietnamese War, so we weren't, massively involved as you guys were. So we had an influence from it, but I think it was a definitely different influence. That's what I just want to put out there.
Yeah. Yeah, and all this stuff is just conversation. I mean, here's the thing, like when we're doing this podcast, this is for us and the listeners. We're figuring out some of the stuff ourselves because we're interested. I always approach things as kind of a beginner, no matter what. Even if I know a lot about something, I approach it as a beginner. So I always approach it as, okay, what do I know, but what do I don't know? And it's probably a lot more that I don't know. And I
Yeah.
always like that way because you can find out more stuff. Because if you approach things with a more curious mindset, then you're always going to find out more. Than if you think it's like with the old Zen koan, like have an empty cup basically when you approach something, because how are you going to fill a cup that's full? So it's like it's impossible. You got to approach things with an empty cup. So there's a lot of questions I have more, and I think and I think if we could get some of these, if these old heads on, because there's a couple I think we could hit up for sure. There's a couple guys I know in Chiang Mai. There's Richard Ehrlich, who I've corresponded with. I'd like to invite him on. So I'm saying this publicly. So he's going to get a message from me probably after this. But getting back to the topic at hand. So with Thailand, because did you listen to that song I had sent you?
Yeah, it was quite. It was very trippy.
Okay, so back to with like what Thailand's role and with the hippies, backpackers, the war, everything going on in Southeast Asia at this time. It's all kind of mixed together. Everyone's got, their ideas about what it was like then. There was a few people that had been here during that time. We'd like to get them on the podcast. But there's this one hotel that I found when I was reading some people's accounts of their time in Thailand during this time. And that's the Malaysia Hotel in Bangkok, which I think is still there, but it's at this time, so it's been there like for like 50 years, 55 years, whatever. This is where a lot of the foreigners stayed. I think it was built in 1967. A lot of the people on the Hippie Trail had stayed there. A lot of the U.S. servicemen on R&R from the war stayed there. It became, like you could imagine, the feeling I get, it was kind of like a heady place. There's, weed being smoked. There's, anything you want. It's kind of got that grimy, dirty Bangkok feel. It's like where the foreigners are going. This is before Khao San Road. So we're talking like we're going way back in time here, before Khao San Road is a thing, before that backpacker era. This is like the old era, right?
Yeah.
And the one kind of funny thing I found about this place, I found this article that it became basically the cheap Charlie budget spot for backpackers before Khao San Road, because their prices were like 120 baht per night, and then they had to basically after the war, all the U.S. servicemen were gone, and they were just relying on backpackers. They had to drop the price in half to 60 baht per night, and then it became really a hot spot for weed, for backpackers and stuff. This is, probably going into the 70s and stuff. So the hotel was kind of on hard times. They needed people. They needed warm bodies in those beds. And I would imagine there was a lot of weed going through there. So then there's this song by this French punk band. And what was your impression of the song? And we'll link it in the show notes. But what was your impression of the song?
It to me is basically like a like you can kind of picture the guy just stoned in a hotel lobby talking to this Asian Thai woman. Like that was my vibe, just this tripped out stoner. It's very trippy, it's quite psychedelic. I mean, the westernized name for them is LSD, the band, so
Yeah, that's their
I like the
initials.
song. I
Yeah.
love that song. It's short, it's kind of odd,
Yeah.
but it's like it's got that Tarantino kind of vibe to it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's kind of got that, like kind of Pulp Fiction. It's a minute long. It's not even really a song. It's more of like a dialogue, but there's a little bit of music, kind of like trippy, kind of like Eastern, like a little bit kind of feeling to it. And they're in Thai. They're asking, "Are you here to smoke? Why did you come to the Malaysia hotel?" They ask in Thai, and then they say, "Did you come to smoke weed? Like smoke ganja?" And then the person says, no, 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 I came for this or that. I forget what they say, but yeah, it's kind of a cool thing. It's kind of a throwback to that era. That's another thing is like, with and in this time, I mean, people always talk about like the old expats in Thailand always talk about how like things were different back then. But I really think probably if you would go back to like the 1960s at this hotel, it probably would feel very different, I would imagine, than it does today.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like it makes me think of those like old school kind of Anthony Bourdain types. Like not hippies, but kind of grizzled writers and journalists that go to these places and it's all kind of like trippy. This is like it didn't seem hippie-ish, if you know what I mean. Like even though we're talking about the hippie trail, it wasn't hippie as we know it. Does that
What
make
do you
sense?
what do you mean?
It's artsy more than I'd say hippie. You know, it's got that like creative kind of old school. I'm gonna sit in the foyer of a hotel drinking coffee, looking outside at the world as I write my memoirs.
Ah, okay.
You know
I
what
see
I
what you
kind
mean.
of mean?
I see. I
Like you
see.
can, and then you got all these interesting characters that are coming in and out.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, I would imagine the characters were legendary at that time because, it's not like it wouldn't have been such an easy trip to get there as it is now. I mean, and to have even gotten to Bangkok at that time was probably a little bit more difficult. It wasn't the infrastructure wasn't totally set up for tourists like it is now. You're kind of on the edge of civilization here. Even though Bangkok was, big beautiful city, language in terms of like language, in terms of like what the comforts, creature comforts of back home. Now, I mean, you can more or less live in Bangkok and feel like you're back home besides the weather. I mean, realistically,
Yeah.
it's fully westernized. At that time, not so much. And I think if you had made it to that point and you're at that Malaysia hotel, it would have been most definitely a cool place to sit. Now, let me ask you. Now, this is a kind of a personal question. When you first came to Thailand, where did you first stay? Now, this is something I wrote about on my True Crime Thailand newsletter a while back, which was about like the experience of hotels and hotels being kind of like a transient place where a lot of, kind of strange things happen, whether it's, crime or, like there's always this kind of mystique around like hotels and there's famous hotels and, and everything. Where did you first stay when you first came to Thailand?
I wish I could remember the name of the hotel, but I remember it was near the Victory, like just off the road where the Victory Monument is in Thailand, if you know where I mean.
In
So
Bangkok.
kind of, yeah, in Bangkok. So kind of on the main road down to the financial district and stuff.
Yeah.
So I was staying at a hotel that was very, very popular with Chinese businessmen. So it was quite interesting, the kind of culture shock that went around it as well.
That's cool. My favorite part of Bangkok when I go there is to stay by Victory Monument. The BTS, the Victory Monument BTS, or is really really a cool place. That whole area, and then it's by Payatai too,
Yeah.
which is the next station previous to that one. Yeah, it's one of my favorite places. I oftentimes stay there. The first time I came to Bangkok, I stayed in the State Tower, and so it was kind of a cool experience there. It's not far from Sapantaksin BTS, just a little walk down that way. The Tanon Charong Krung road, which goes up the river. So it's not far from the river, and everything. And I still remember kind of the magic I felt like walking around Bangkok. And the first meal I had was at a Yentafo noodle shop. I had Yentafo as my first meal there on Tanon Charung Krung Road. And yes, I still remember the shop. I try to get down there every time I go to Bangkok. Do you remember the first meal you had when in Bangkok?
Oh yeah, yeah, pad krapao, and then now it's my staple. If I'm ever on death row, I just want a massive pile of pad krapao. That's all I want.
Yeah, that's pretty popular. What was the first weed you had smoked in Thailand?
See, my first time to Thailand was before I was even a cheeky little stoner. So I
Ah,
was a good boy the first time I went. I mean, I smelt it around Khao San Road, but I was kind of like oblivious. I was a little bit innocent back then.
okay. So when's
The,
the first
the,
time you smoked weed then in Thailand?
so the first time I smoked weed in Thailand was actually in Chiang Mai with some more rural friends of mine that live up kind of the Chiang Rai, not in Chiang Rai, but that direction out of Chiang Mai. And I think from what I remember, it was some sort of squirrel tail. So
Okay, so some sort of local weed.
yeah, it was definitely local.
Nice. Nice. That sounds cool. Yeah, I think the first time for me it was definitely in Chiang Mai. Trying to think, I had a friend from Wales, and we would hang out, and he had a friend that would make that made like finger hash. So I had some of that. It was really good. And they would get flour as well, and then they made weed cookies that were pretty good. I remember I ate a weed cookie and I got really, really stoned. And I went to this restaurant, which is now not there anymore. But if you know Chiang Mai at all, you would have known it as Spades. It was near, it was on off the moat, and it's ran by this Lebanese family. And it was like really good, like meats and like hummus and salads, and you could sit there and kind of people watch because it's on like a busy intersection, not far from Chiang Mai Gate, just before it. And it was a pretty popular restaurant. They sold it to a Kiwi and an American guy, and they ran it into the ground. And I won't mention their names, but if you're Chiang Mai people, you probably know what I'm talking about. It has a whole bit of drama around it. But Spade's restaurant, yeah, we were sitting there. We got really stoned. Then we took a walk. We went to walk to the park there in the old city. Walked to watch a movie. So it was pretty cool. And yeah, that was I remember. I think really the first time I got high was eating that cookie. I think. So yeah. But in any case, was there anything else about the hippie trail or overland trail or anything else that we didn't touch on that you thought was interesting, or what do you think, Sita?
I think one big thing I want to point out about the hippie trail and stuff is without it, we wouldn't have the modern weed we have today, if you know what I mean. Like we spoke about people bringing back hash and stuff, but also people would bring back weed and also sometimes seeds,
Okay.
especially to the places like Amsterdam, Denmark, places like that. A lot of the modernized genetics that we have now, like, come from these seeds that people brought back in the day. You know, the whole rumors of like this in America, like Acapulco, whatever, Acapulco gold. I can never say
Uh-huh.
that word.
Yeah.
So that kind of like that era stemmed from these Thai seeds being brought over, then crossed with like Mexican strains or um African strains, and those kind of built the building blocks up to what we have today. So without the like whole hippie trail, even in the early days, like bringing back seeds was such a big thing for what we have now, like massively so. Like strains like Blue Dream, the Northern Lights, Hazes, all have like roots in Thai land races, Indian land races. So thanks to the hippie trail, you have your fucking gelatos, your sherbets, your cookies. So give thanks to these men of old that just brought back seeds, you know? I just wanted to bring that up. So like the hazes and stuff that were brought back, well, they weren't brought back, but the seeds that were brought back from Thailand and India came to Amsterdam. Danish people, they are big for the early breeding of cannabis. So thanks to these like land race genetics from Thailand and stuff, they built the building blocks to what we have now.
Right. Right. Okay. Cool. Are we gonna leave it there?
Yeah, can leave it there. I can ramble more about genetics, or
You can ramble whatever about whatever you want, my friend. You are the
I just,
star of the show, dude.
I just think it's important that we give credence to these like old heads that probably didn't think they were doing such a massive thing, bringing seeds and like weed with seeds. And I imagine some of these strains that were bred over here were just accidental, like seeds in a bag seeds that they were like, oh, this is kind of cool. So like the whole hippie trail era was a revolution for weed in multiple aspects of just the culture side, the genetics, and building up truly what we have today.
That is interesting, and I think that's why I wanted to really talk about this subject for this week, is because I think we kind of forget like the origins of some of this stuff, which to me are always interesting for this reason. It's because these stories, it was a lot harder to get weed, to get good seeds. Now we're spoiled for choices,
Yep.
but at that time it was, you had to rely on this network that had stretched across, the Eurasian landmass, to bring in hash, to bring in seeds, to bring in cannabis, to bring in, all this stuff that has made, weed what it is today. And the stories around that are really interesting. So, I know we did this episode just to kind of, I mean, already we're pretty much an hour in. We could definitely dive a lot deeper onto some of these subjects. I think one of the goals that I have for, future episodes is if we could get some of these people that were around in the 60s, 70s, probably even 80s, like at the tail end of some of this stuff. Because from what I understand, at least from what's been told, a lot of this, the hippie trail, quote unquote, as we're using it, ended in 1979 with the Iran Revolution and then the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. So that kind of put the kibosh to a lot of this, as at
Yep.
least from what I understand. So it became a lot more difficult to traverse Central Asia, like, from Western to Central Asia. And so, it became kind of a thing in the past. And then normal tourism resumed with flights to Southeast Asia, East Asia. But that Central Asian kind of route, with the route, basically was ended at that time. Although there are some probably anecdotes that of people still crossing over. Most of it was done by that time. That, like, late the last part of 1979, and then early 80s, and the world kind of changed after that point. So, but if there's anyone who has been on that was on this overland hippie trail, if you were involved with it at any point and you want to share your story, please get in touch with us, because we'd like to, as Siththa said, kind of give respect where respect's due with some of these old heads and people that, have stories that, I think people need to hear about. So,
Oh, definitely. I don't want to just regurgitate stuff I've read and heard, and I want to kind of help bring people who can tell you their stories, the facts as they know them.
right, for sure. Cool, man. Well, that's going to be an hour for this episode, pretty much. We'll come back next week. What are we planning on talking about next week?
I mean, next week I kind of was thinking maybe I could talk to you a little bit more on the modern side about like what I experienced over there this year, but we'll see what comes up.
Like a trip report,
Yeah, a little bit, you know what I mean?
like a
I got a lot
trip,
to say.
a trip report, trip report.
Exactly. Tripception.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's going to be episode 3 then. Is Sita's trip report. when he came to Thailand. When did you come? What were the dates?
25th of September to the 8th of October.
Okay, so a couple solid weeks. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that would be good. That would give people who are not in Thailand a perspective of what it was like. People in Thailand a perspective of what the tourist experience is like, even though you're not like a newbie tourist or anything, but you came for a short period of time uh, as a tourist for that time at least.
Yeah.
So cool. That sounds like a good next episode. So yeah, we'll sign off for now. Until next week. Take care, everybody. This was Siam Smoke Sessions.
Bye.